Gareth nibbled on a piece of bread but otherwise abstained from the food. Instead, he elected to watch his friend's energetic eating. She barely acknowledged his presence as she downed what to him was a truly insane amount of food. The only sounds she made were various mms of enjoyment. After a solid few minutes, she finally looked up to him, mouthful, and spoke.
Mm-hmm. You not gonna?
She pointed at the stew.
Probably not a good idea. And, Pen, you've got a bit of...
He pointed to her face.
Hmm?
She brought her hand to her face and found a bit of stew on her chin.
Oh, thanks.
She said as she wiped it off with her hand. Gareth winced at the less-than-hygienic act. He hadn't thought about it much, but she really wasn't the type of person to be concerned with cleanliness. Her room on the ship looked like a bomb had gone on in it if the few times he'd seen it weren't simply bad timing. He recognized that he kept to very high standards, but he'd been raised to keep prim and proper, and it felt wrong if he wasn't clean. He realized that he'd begun to worry his head frills absent-mindedly again as he sat there.
What are those on your head anyway? You're always messing with them.
She looked at them closely for the first time. They didn't sit like hair on a human, more of a crown of pearly purple coral, but thinner and not so rigid at times.
I suppose you'd call them frills or spines, even.
He wiggled them.
They're another leftover from earlier evolutionary stage, not that they don't have use still. Sensory organs that detect vibrations. Not as helpful in air, but under a liquid medium that conducts vibrations better. Quite nice. You may be able to lift immense weights, but I bet I can see far better than you underwater. That said, it means they're quite sensitive, so I keep them as clean as possible. It's a terribly itchy sensation if I don't.
Pen swallowed what she was eating.
Well, they're really cool. They look like a purple coral, but they shimmer like pearls.
Oh well, thank you.
Pen lifted the bowl to her face and downed the last bit of stew she'd gotten. Then she set the bowl down with a thud, burped loudly, and let out a long sigh.
That, was fan-fucking-tastic.
Gareth chuckled a bit.
You certainly seem to enjoy it.
Home-cooked and fresh instead of sealed ration packs or ever-preserved food substitutes. And on top of that, after trudging through a forest for the better part of 2 days, you bet I did. I'm clean, I'm fed, and now it's time for the final part of the trifecta.
She stood and brought their plates, bowls, and silverware to the sink before turning back to him.
Gonna guess our sleeping arrangements are that-a-way.
She pointed and he followed her gesture to a door with a piece of paper taped to it. There were a bunch of arrows pointing inward.
Lead on.
He responded as he hopped out of his chair. He scuttled over as she opened the door, and they both saw a small but comfortable-looking guest room set up for them. A bed sat in the far right corner, made up with heavy quilts and puffy pillows. Next to it along the far wall was a couch that had been pulled out somewhat and also done up as a place to sleep. Other than that, the room was bare, save for a small desk and accompanying bookcase to the left of the door. Pen spoke as she surveyed the room.
If you want the bed, I'm honestly thinking the couch would be more comfortable for me. Bed's way too much.
Gareth shot her a confused look.
What?
She continued.
It's all right, I mean it. I don't want to steal the...
Still, Pen, you can have them both if you want, remember?
Oh, right. You don't sleep. You don't even rest.
I might sit down and relax. I could close my eyes and meditate, but I'll probably just read.
He nodded to the desk.
Or say hello to our hosts when they go back.
He pointed back to the door.
All right. Well, by all means.
She walked over to the bed and about fell right into it, dress and all. In a short time, she'd made her way under the copious covers and thrown all the pillows to her feet. Gareth hopped up into the little wooden chair and pulled out his data pad.
What you reading?
Pen asked. He looked over to see that only a part of her was visible. The mattress was so fluffy that her weight pulled her down into it.
Some early human literature, actually. Current events have inspired me.
Oh?
Yes, I started with the Gilgamesh Fellow. An interesting read, though I think I may be missing a lot of context to really digest it. Then I actually moved to some of your namesake's literature. The story of Odysseus sailing through Scylla and Charybdis. I believe I understand the implication of why they would call you.
Mm.
was all Penn offered.
Well, anyway, I thought it interesting how capricious and flawed those deities were. Very different from early violent religion.
His mouth may have moved past the name, but his mind dove back into what he'd seen on Samir's personal computer. He understood a bit better. They gave her the name because from anyone's perspective, anyone other than her, all they knew was that one person had walked out of that, and everyone behind her was dead.
Not that we had so many different early mythologies, which I do find fascinating how varied the array of...
Gareth petered out. The verbal facade was failing. He'd meant to ask her, or at least just tell her that he'd seen what he'd seen. He meant to mention it to her immediately, but then thought privacy might be preferable. Then, when they had as much privacy as they'd ever get, what with being lost in a fucking forest, he just couldn't find the courage. He didn't like secrets much, and he felt disingenuous not being upfront about such a thing. He felt it was wrong to keep it from her. His career was built on tact and diplomacy, but he knew when he was being tactful and when he was simply being cowardly.
Penn, I may have something to share with you, and I don't really know how to say it, other than a small apology for not admitting it sooner, but your friend Samir showed me, or rather, allowed me to find the footage of what happened, the building and the city and etc.
Penn was silent.
I just felt you should know that I know, and I know you may not have wanted me to know, and I mean, Samir shares some blame, though he clearly had your best interest at heart. I mean, I can't imagine keeping something like... Well, anyway, if you'd like an apology, I am... Penn?
She snored. She was asleep. She didn't hear a damn thing he just said. Then again, that might have been a good thing considering the absolute word soup that he'd spilled. Still, it didn't stop his fury.
You... Ugh. Whatever, if I don't say anything for a long while now, it's your damn fault. Hairless primate.
His frills shuddered as he started out of the chair. He froze halfway through as she shifted in the bed. Had she woken up? Perhaps she'd only been pretend. Another loud snore? Gareth huffed and finished hopping out of the chair. Of course not. He walked out of the room with his datapad, pondering how hairless primate wasn't technically accurate. She had hair, just not as much as the others. Their dispositions, on the other hand. He waved away the thought, focusing back on his datapad. He took a seat on the cushy couch in the house's den and waited for their host to get back. He'd swapped from literature to news in the few hours it took to meet the masters of the house. More new trade routes had opened up. They gained immediate use, which would have been abnormal if it weren't for the obvious. Attacks were still happening. In fact, the rate of these occurrences was increasing. It wasn't piracy like anything he'd known before. There were never survivors when bodies were even found, which was rare as there was a terrifying lack of any footprint. Camera feeds were blank and navigational data was often scrubbed. Even the causes of death were bizarre or more likely intentionally obscured. More often than even finding anything was finding rubble, a scuttled ship. Gareth couldn't help but think to the human male Penn trounced. What caught his mind more than the brutal tactics was the silencing of the man. Penn was right. What other reason could the killer have had to kill that man but no one else? He had information. Was this then a human thing? The birth of Terran brand piracy? That was a terrifying thought. Just as he mused how much the topic would be discussed at the conference, the front door opened and pulled him from his thoughts. 2 women entered. Older, he thought, than Penn, but not by too much. One was rather short for a human, but broad-shouldered and boasted a physique closer, if still a far cry to Penn. The other was taller and wore a wide-brimmed hat.
Oh, hey there, little guy.
The tall one said cheerily.
Any of my whiskey left?
Asked the other.